Hello students, and welcome back to your survey of human anatomy and physiology class. Today we're going to look at chapter 13, the cardiovascular system. The parts of the cardiovascular system include the heart and the blood vessels. And carrying blood away from the heart are the arteries. Arteries give rise to arterioles, and even smaller than that, the capillaries, and then to vanules, and then larger veins, and veins carry blood back to the heart. Now, the location of the heart is posterior to the sternum. It is medial to the lungs. It is anterior to the vertebral column. It's in the thoracic cavity, as you saw in chapter 1. It is cone-shaped. You can see that it's cone-shaped or shaped like a triangle. And if you know the parts of a triangle, this pointed part here is called the apex, and then up here where vessels are leaving the heart, the major vessels are leaving and coming into the heart, is called the base. The size of the heart is about 14 centimeters long, and there's about 2.54 centimeters in an inch, so that's roughly 5.5 inches long, and about 9 centimeters width, and that works out to be about 3.5 inches wide. It's roughly, if you put both of your hands together and make a fist, that's about the size of your heart. The size of the heart is relative to the size of the individual. So you can have a very small person has a little bit smaller heart than a very large person. The coverings of the heart, you have the fibrous pericardium. Peri means around, enveloping. Okay, so on the outermost layer of the heart is the fibrous pericardium, fibrous connective tissue. Okay, if you were to place the heart in a paper bag, that paper bag would represent that fibrous pericardium. You have a little bit of space, and then you are actually lining the fibrous pericardium would be the parietal pericardium. So fibrous pericardium and lining the inside of the fibrous pericardium, and we know that this parietal means that this membrane is lining a cavity. So that fibrous pericardium on the inside of that would be the parietal pericardium. And then on the surface of the heart itself is the epicardium, also known as visceral pericardium. And so between the parietal pericardium and the visceral pericardium, you're going to have a little space, and that you would find pericardial fluid, like that serous fluid. Okay, so fibrous is the outermost pericardium, and then lining the inside of that fibrous pericardium membrane is the parietal pericardium. A little bit of space with pericardial fluid, and then the visceral pericardium directly on the surface of the heart, forming the epicardium. There are three distinct layers to the wall of the heart. We're going to go from the inside out, and lining the inside of the heart is the endocardium. So the most inward layer, the innermost layer, endo, you'll see this prefix a whole lot when we're talking about the inside of something, endocardium. The endocardium is made up of epithelial tissue with a little connective tissue. Myo tells you exactly what type of tissue this is. Remember, we said that's a prefix that means muscle. So cardiac muscle is found in the myocardial layer. Epi means upon, so upon the heart is the visceral pericardium, also known as the epicardium. So here's that fibrous pericardium. The fibrous pericardium lined with the parietal pericardium, a little bit of space with the pericardial fluid, and then lining the heart itself would be the visceral pericardium or the epicardium. There are basically two pumps. The heart consists of two separate pumps. The right side of the heart pumps the oxygen poor or deoxygenated blood to the lungs so that the blood can pick up oxygen. You have an exchange of carbon dioxide leaving the blood, and then oxygen moving into the blood by a process called diffusion. The left side of the heart pumps oxygenated blood to the body. So the right side, it goes from the right side of the heart to the lungs, back into the left side, and out of the left side to the body. So the left side receives the blood rich in oxygen from the lungs and then pumps the blood to the body. Okay, so here we had the blood being received on the right side of the heart. Right receives, the blood leaves the left. Right receives, left leaves. Okay, all right, so coming to into the heart would be veins, and leaving the heart, the vessels are called arteries. So the superior vena cava brings the blood in from the upper part of the body. The inferior vena cava is a vein that brings blood from the lower part of the body. Then you have a vein that brings blood from the cardiac tissue and dumps into the coronary sinus, so into the right chamber, right atrium. Blood is received from systemic circulation, or systemic means all the systems of the body, systemic circulation. So from the body is from all of the tissues outside of the heart. Now from the heart to the lungs is called pulmonary circulation. So two pumps, the right and left half, and then there's systemic circulation, and then there's pulmonary circulation. Pulmonary, heart and lungs, pulmonary, heart and lungs, systemic, everything else from the heart to the body, all the other systems, systemics, all the other systems, including the heart tissue itself. Okay, so if we are talking about the heart, the blood that provides nutrients and oxygen to the heart to keep it alive. What system does that belong to? That circulation of the blood to the heart tissues. What system does that belong to of the two systems? Pulmonary or systemic circulation? Systemic. Okay, because it's not going between the heart and the lungs. So it is systemic takes the blood to the other systems. The right atrium is the holding chamber for deoxygenated blood. Oxygen poor blood receives, the right atrium receives oxygen poor blood from the body. It also receives oxygen poor blood from heart tissue. Okay, so it's a holding chamber for oxygen poor blood from the body. The left atrium is a holding chamber for oxygen-rich blood from the lungs. The right ventricle is still dealing with oxygen poor blood. So the blood moves from the right atrium to the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it's sent to the lungs from the right ventricle. The right atrium receives the blood from the lung, so it's rich in oxygen, where that exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen occurs. And then the left ventricle has the job of pumping the oxygen-rich blood to all the tissues of the body and to the heart tissue. Okay, so the right atrium, let's go back over these again, receives blood from the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava and the coronary vein and into the coronary sinus from the heart tissue. So those three things dump blood into the right atrium. Poorly oxygenated blood from the body and the heart. Then it's pumped to the right ventricle, and the right ventricle pumps it to the lungs, where it picks up oxygen, gives up its carbon dioxide with an exchange. Then the blood is pumped into the left atrium from the lungs to the left ventricle and pumped out of the body, or out of the heart, to the rest of the body from the left ventricle. Okay, heart valves. Its function is to keep the blood moving in the proper direction and only in one direction. There are 4 valves of 2 types. The first type is atrioventricular valves, sometimes referred to as AV valves. AV valves, atrioventricular valves. They're found between the atria. Atria is the plural form of atrium. Atria, the ending with an A, means that we're talking about 2 atriums, atria, and the ventricle. So atrioventricular valves between the atria and the ventricles. They contain flaps, which we call cusps, which are held in place by chordae tendineae and papillary muscles, and we'll talk a little bit more about those in just a minute. And then the second type of valves are the semilunar valves. They're at the base of the arteries leaving the heart, and they're loose folds of tissue that face the artery that don't have chordae tendineae. The first one is the tricuspid valve. It's between the right atrium and the right ventricle. It is also called the right AV valve, the tricuspid. Tri meaning 3, cusp, flaps. Okay, so this valve has 3 flaps. It is found between the right atrium and the right ventricle. Now, another type of AV valve is the bicuspid valve. It is found between the left atrium and the left ventricle. Bi means that it only has 2 flaps or 2 cusps. Bicuspid valve. Now, some doctors or scientists make it a little bit more difficult to remember because they have another name for a bicuspid valve or atrioventricular valve. This one is also referred to as the mitral valve. So if you've heard of a person having mitral valve prolapse, usually causes a murmur. It's not closing properly. Okay, or a mitral valve replacement. That means that they're replacing this valve found between the left atrium and the left ventricle, the bicuspid valve. And then again, a semilunar valve. The pulmonary valve is between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. Remember, pulmonary circulation is between the heart and the lungs. So this pulmonary valve goes from the right ventricle. The blood is pushed from the right ventricle through the pulmonary valve to the pulmonary trunk to the lungs. And then also semilunar valve is the aortic valve. It's found between the left ventricle. The left ventricle is going to have oxygen-rich blood, and the left ventricle will send the blood through the aortic valve to the aorta to the body. Okay, so atrioventricular valves and semilunar valves. This one semilunar valve is the pulmonary valve, going from the right ventricle to the lungs. The blood would have to go through the pulmonary valve to the pulmonary trunk. Okay, from the left ventricle, aortic valve. The whole idea of valves is to keep the blood moving in one direction. Okay, so let's look at these valves here. You have the tricuspid. Here's the tricuspid. And I'm going to jump over here and see this tissue here, connective tissue here, is called the chordae tendineae. Chordae tendineae, you've heard of people saying that you're pulling on my heartstrings. Well, that's basically what these are, heartstrings. It helps to allow that valve to open and close, allowing the blood to move in only one direction so you don't have flow back into a chamber from the ventricle to the atrium. You don't want that. So it allows the blood to flow in only one direction. And then the chordae tendineae is attached to this muscle. That is a papillary muscle found protruding from the walls of the heart. Okay, so here is the tricuspid, tricuspid. Try before you buy. The right ventricle is going to have the tricuspid. The right AV valve or atrioventricular valve, tricuspid. And then the mitral valve, the bicuspid, would be on the left side of the heart. Okay, this would be the bicuspid is also the mitral valve. Then you have the pulmonary valve. Okay, so the blood comes in from the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. And I'm going to go over this a lot of times. So the superior vena cava is this major vein. Veins bring blood back to the heart. Superior from the upper body, vena cava. And then the inferior vena cava from the lower body. And then you have the coronary vein would dump right on it would be found right on the edge here. And it would dump the blood from the heart, bringing it back from the heart tissue, poorly oxygenated, into the right atrium. From the right atrium through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle. From the right ventricle through the pulmonary valve and the pulmonary trunk. Okay? Pulmonary sending this oxygen-poor blood to the lungs. Okay, so the right pulmonary artery would take it to the right lung, the left pulmonary arteries away to the left pulmonary artery to the left lung. Okay, now from the lungs, the blood would come back through the left pulmonary veins and the right pulmonary the right pulmonary veins. See, these are still fairly large vessels, but nowhere near the same as the other arteries and veins. Okay, they're a little bit smaller, so there's several of them, but this blood is coming back from the lungs to the left atrium. So now you have oxygen-rich blood. It's coming to the left atrium, goes through the bicuspid or mitral valve into the left ventricle. Then the left ventricle is going to contract, and we don't see it here, but this blood is going to go this direction through the aortic valve, one of the two semilunar valves. The pulmonary valve is a semilunar valve, and the aortic valve is a semilunar valve. Okay, so the left ventricle pushes that blood into the aorta, and the aorta takes it to the body for systemic circulation. Okay, all this oxygen-rich blood goes through the aorta. Before we go on here, I wanted to show you something about this picture. So the right side receives blood from the body. Okay, the right atrium from the body, blood from the body goes to the right ventricle. The right ventricle is pumping through the pulmonary valve to the pulmonary trunk and to the lungs. Now the lungs isn't a great distance away, so this doesn't have to push that blood very far. So look at the thickness of the wall on the right side as it compares to the left side. The left side has to push that blood through the aorta, and it's got to make it to all the systems, so it has to pump the blood much more with much more force, and so the left side of the heart is much more, the wall is much thicker, more muscular than the right side. And separating the two ventricle is the interventricular septum. So a septum usually divides things into right and left halves. Interventricular septum is the wall that separates the two ventricles. Okay, we have a picture of a real heart here, and there's the right atrium. The cusps are the flaps of the tricuspid valve. Here's the chordae tendineae, the heartstrings. Okay, the interventricular wall here with the papillary muscles, the chordae tendineae attached to the papillary muscles, and then on this picture you have the pulmonary valve there, and that pulmonary valve is sending blood from the right ventricle to the lungs. And then the aortic valve, these are the two semilunar valves. Aortic valve, remember, from the left ventricle to the aorta, but it has to travel through the aortic valve. Then this is the right side of the heart, so this would be the tricuspid valve. Left side of the heart, this would be the bicuspid valve. So that's a superior view of a cross-section of a human heart. The superior vena cava, again, carries oxygen-poor blood, so it's deoxygenated to the heart from all parts of the body. But the superior vena cava from the upper body, it enters the right atrium. The inferior vena cava is now these are large veins bringing blood from the body. Remember, veins bring blood into the heart and leaving the heart, the arteries. The pulmonary trunk is actually the only artery that carries the deoxygenated blood. So remember, it goes from the right ventricle through the pulmonary valve to the pulmonary trunk. Oxygen poor blood is leaving the right ventricle, going through the pulmonary trunk. So it is a vessel carrying blood away from the heart. So any vessels carrying blood away from the heart are going to be arteries. Bringing bloods back to the heart will be veins. So in all the systemic circulation, the arteries are going to have oxygen rich blood. In systemic circulation, the veins will have oxygen poor blood. But in the case between the heart and the lungs, the pulmonary circulation, the artery is going to have oxygen poor or deoxygenated blood. So from the heart, away from the heart are arteries. So from the heart to the lungs, oxygen poor blood is carried by the pulmonary arteries. And then you have the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen at the lungs. And then the pulmonary vein are the only veins in the body that are carrying oxygen-rich blood, oxygenated blood, back to the heart, so the heart can pump it, that oxygen-rich blood to the body. So that from the lungs, where we've had an exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen, to the heart, to the left atrium, so that it can go through the mitral valve to the left ventricle, through the aortic valve, through the aorta to the rest of the body. The aorta is the largest artery in the body. It carries oxygenated blood to all parts of the body. The left ventricle pumps the blood through the aortic valve to the aorta. The aorta fibricates or branches off and carries the blood, oxygen-rich blood, to the entire body. Okay, let's go back over the blood vessels associated with the heart and the circulation of blood. From the inferior, or the lower part of the body, the inferior vena cava, that major vein blood vessel is delivering blood from the lower part of the body to the right atrium. From the upper part of the body would be the superior vena cava, that major vein delivering oxygen poor blood to the right atrium. You would also have the coronary vein delivering oxygen poor blood through the coronary sinus from the heart tissue itself. A cardiac vein. So those three vessels are delivering oxygen poor blood to the right atrium. That right atrium will contract and push that blood through the tricuspid or right AV valve into the right ventricle. The right ventricle will then contract and send the blood through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk, this is an artery, but it is carrying oxygen poor blood, so it's colored blue here. The pulmonary trunk will bifurcate that means branches off, and so the right branch is the right pulmonary artery, will take oxygen poor blood to the right lung. The left pulmonary artery is taking oxygen poor blood to the left lung. Now, because we have circulation here between the heart and the lung, this would be pulmonary circulation. Now in the lung, it's going to exchange that carbon dioxide for oxygen. That oxygen-rich blood is going to return to the heart through the left pulmonary vein from the left lung and the right pulmonary veins from the right lungs, and all of those veins, pulmonary veins, are going to deliver that oxygen-rich blood to the left atrium. The left atrium is then going to contract and send that oxygen-rich blood through the mitral valve or the bicuspid into the left ventricle. The left ventricle is then going to contract and send that blood through the aortic valve, through the aorta. And as the aorta sends the blood to the various systems, then that would begin systemic circulation. The skeleton of the heart, here are the valves as we looked at just a minute ago. You have fibrous rings in which the valves are attached, where you have the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve, the mitral valve or bicuspid. This fibrous skeleton holds everything in place. The tricuspid valve. Everything is held into place by these fibrous rings. If you will look right here, the opening of the left coronary artery. So this very tiny area, this artery right here off of the aorta, is the first branch off of the aorta, and the coronary having to do with the heart. So vessels that are associated with the heart tissue itself are called coronary vessels, but coronary artery, blood from the heart to the tissue in the heart to provide the oxygen and the nutrients needed by that heart tissue. Now, I'm going to make an assignment with this chapter. I want you to write me a paper on the path of blood through the heart. I'm going to give you more information on that assignment very soon, within the next couple of days. But the path of blood through the heart, systemic. Remember, that's all the systems throughout the body, including the heart, would be part of the systemic circuit or circulation. Through the vena cava, superior and inferior vena cava, to the right atrium, through the tricuspid valve. The blood is only moving in one direction, we hope. Tricuspid valve to the right ventricle. It's pushed through the pulmonary valve, through the pulmonary trunk, where it divides or splits off into the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. The pulmonary arteries to the lungs, you have arterioles and then capillaries that are in the alveolar sacs, and that is where the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen through a process of diffusion happens. And then that oxygen poor blood now becomes oxygen rich blood and returns to the heart through the pulmonary veins to the left atrium, through the bicuspid or mitral valve to the left ventricle. The left ventricle pushes it through the aortic valve to the aorta and to the systemic circulation to the body systems. Okay, all right, let's go through it one more time with the diagram. So the blood is coming in from the vena cava, the superior vena cava from the upper body, the inferior vena cava from the lower body, also the coronary vein will bring it in from the heart tissue, dumps into the right atrium, goes through the right AV valve or the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle. The right ventricle contracts and sends that blood through the pulmonary valve to the pulmonary trunk, and the pulmonary trunk will bifurcate or branch into the right and left. There's the right and the left, and it's leaving the heart, so it's going to be an artery, the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery, taking the oxygen poor blood to the lungs. And the alveolar capillaries is where you have the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen. Carbon dioxide is in high concentration of this oxygen poor blood, and oxygen is in low concentration. So diffusion happens, and that is the definition of diffusion, the movement of molecules from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration. So what happens here is that carbon dioxide is in high concentration in the blood. So in the lungs it's going to leave these alveolar capillaries. And in this blood you have low concentrations of oxygen. So oxygen is going to go into the blood through the capillaries because it's moving from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration in the blood. Okay? In this alveolus. And so this oxygen-rich blood is carried back from these capillaries to arterioles, coming back to, or actually vanuoles, capillaries to vanuoles. Veins, the pulmonary veins, bring the blood back to the heart, and this is red and it indicates oxygen rich. It's the only oxygen rich blood carried in a vein is the pulmonary veins. Okay, dumping into the left atrium, going through the mitral or bicuspid valve to the left ventricle. The left ventricle pumps that blood through the aortic valve, through the aorta, and ascending and descending aorta to all parts of the body and to the tissues where you have oxygen-rich blood and you have the exchange of carbon dioxide. Metabolism is a process that makes a lot of carbon dioxide, so we've got to get rid of that carbon dioxide because it's not useful for us. It can be harmful for us, but you need the oxygen for everything to happen. So oxygen is being given up to the tissues. Carbon dioxide has been picked up by the blood and carried back to the heart by way of the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava. So from capillaries to vanuoles to these major veins back to the heart. Okay, that's where we're going to stop, and we'll pick up later with blood supply to the heart.